Howdy and welcome back to the workshop. In today's episode, we're talking about hammers and hammer heads and hammer handles and how to make them good. Before we jump in, quick thank you to today's sponsor, which is Harry's. All right, now we need to talk about something that's a bit of a sensitive subject. For many people out there, when they don't shave, they accidentally grow a beard or a mustache or something. That is the case for Isaiah, who's standing behind the camera. He hasn't shaved for 2 days. And shaving isn't just for those people who are fortunate enough to be able to grow a beard and not look like they're 12 years old. And that's where today's sponsor, which is Harry's, comes into play. Harry's makes shaving quite an easy and enjoyable process thanks to their very high quality shaving and men's grooming products. Now, I just went on a 3.5-week long trip all over the place and I took Harry's products with me. It was a convenient and easy and high quality way to keep myself looking 12 years old. Now, Harry's has a couple of cool features built into the razors that I really like. For one thing, they have a secret blade along the backside that makes getting into the tight areas a little bit easier. You don't have to get the whole face of the razor up there. You just use the back of the razor. It's very nice. They also have a swiveling head that makes it quite easy to match and find the perfect angle to contour to your face. All of their blades are made in their own factory in Germany. The handle has a very nice, hefty weight to it. And half of the handle is made out of recycled plastic, which is neat. Now, I really like their little shave gel containers. They're quite easy to travel with, and they have an awesome offer for you guys to be able to try that out with their starter set, which comes with a weighted handle, a blade cartridge, a blade cover, and the foaming gel container. Now, it's not just me. Isaiah has also been using Harry's products for a long time, just because we both happen to like their product and the company itself. Now, with the holidays coming up, it's also a great time to get a Harry's gift box for your loved ones. All you have to do is go to harrys.com/Will Stelter for a $5 starter set, normally a $13 value, but for you, just $5. That's a good deal if you ask me. So thank you, Harry's, for sponsoring today's episode. Make sure to go check them out at the link down in the description down below. With that, let's jump back on into the video. Now, some of you who are in the know might know that hammers are usually the way that we interact with hot metal or metal that we want to beat around in the art of blacksmithing. Now, we use everything from the weeest of little baby hammers all the way up to big old honkin' sledgehammers and pretty much everything in between. Now, usually they fall in kind of the in-between state. Got a whole rack of hammers here that I enjoy. Everything from a 3.5-pound rounding hammer to cross peens. I've got straight peens. I have a lot of rounding hammers though. Partially because the guys that I forge with a lot use a lot of rounding hammers, and so those are the hammers that I've ended up with. Today, however, we're going to be talking about a cross peen hammer. Now, a cross peen hammer is built different because it doesn't have two round faces. It has a flat face, and then what this right here is called the peen. Shut up, I know. This is a different kind of cross peen. This is a hammer made by my buddy Ethan Hardy up in Canada. This is a very tight cross peen. The width of the cross peen kind of defines the kind of forging that you can do with it. A very tight cross peen is going to move material very aggressively, but it'll leave bigger dings, whereas a fatter, wider cross peen will move material a little bit slower, but it'll be a lot easier to finish out that forging, and it'll leave much wider marks that are easier to forge out later on. Now, there's a plethora of different styles of cross peens. Cross peens are pretty much the most prolific forging hammer out there that there is. Each Western European country has a different style of cross peen. There is the Italian cross peen. There's the French cross peen, which looks very similar to the Italian cross peen. They're a lot better known. They just look a little bit different. There is Czech style cross peens. There's Swedish style cross peens. There's German style cross peen hammers. And then British people pretty much only use ball peen hammers, which is really weird. And then Americans use kind of everything. I'd say most Americans either use a small German style cross peen or a rounding hammer, or something in between. We use a lot of different stuff. Everyone has their own kind of hammer that they like. Now, as you can imagine, with each different hammer, the shape of the handle and the length of the handle comes into play quite a bit, depending on how you want to interact with that hammer. There's kind of two main types of handles that people do. We got what we call the matchstick style. This is the Brian Brazil rounding hammer style. This is a hammer that Ethan Hardy and I made 5 years ago now. This is the style of handle that Alec has on his hammers, both from the Alec Steel Co. and the hammers that he has always done for the last 30, 40 years, however long he's been making handles. I personally really like the kind of palm swell style. I just like a little bit of curve in my handle. I like to grab and hang on to it there. Now for a general forging hammer like this one, we have kind of a couple different swells and contours in here. It takes a little bit to understand why those swells are there and how to make them look good. I see a lot of guys who make their own hammer handles who kind of have a general idea that there's kind of some waves and contours in a handle, but they haven't actually figured out why those swells and contours are supposed to be in the places that they are at. The first swell that we encounter when we come down off of the head of the hammer is this one right here. That's because the eye of the hammer, which is an hourglass shape, wants to move down. You wedge it from the top, which pushes it down, and it needs to have a swell on the hammer handle to wedge into. Otherwise, if you were to wedge it from the top, it would just keep on falling down the hammer. We don't want that to happen. We want it to have a place to settle. After that, it necks down again just a little bit on both sides, and then it swells back out right around the 2/3 mark of the handle. And that is where I generally like to grab my handles. And the reason why you want to have a swell there, if that's where you want to grab your handles, is because when you hold your hand like this and you go like that, you see that there's an indent right there in the center of your hand. Generally, handle makers make something called a palm swell that your hand wants to fit into. Now, you can also tell that there is a bit of variability in the length of our handles here. Generally, the heavier the hammer, the longer the handle. Now, that's not always true, because some guys want to have like a 7-8 pound hammer that they use for driving drifts, and they only want that to be a one-handed hammer, because quite frankly, it's very awkward to swang around a 2-foot long handle when you're only going to be using this hammer with one hand. This hammer is about 2 pounds heavier than this 6-pound hammer, and this is just right for good, heavy, one-handed work. And this right here, this Italian-style cross peen, is a 5-pound hammer. This is going to be a really nice size of hammer. I don't think I'm going to use it one-handed because I already have this heavy one-handed hammer. I want this to be a light striking hammer. That means that it's going to be used with 2 hands by one person. It's really awkward to use 2 hands with 2 people. You have to be very much in tune with them, and it doesn't work out so good. So I want this to be a 2-handed, one-person striking sledge. And I want the handle for this hammer to be kind of halfway in between this and this. This is a 14-inch handle. This is a 24-inch handle. And if you are okay at math, about halfway in between is about a 20-inch handle, and that's what I'm going to shoot for. So handle will be about that long. It's just the right length, not going to be super far in the way, be able to do light striking work with it. So let's move on to talking about how we're actually going to get the handle onto this head. When you're throwing a hammer handle onto a hammer, you kind of got 2 options. You can either buy a pre-made handle from the store, or you can rip it down from raw stock and go to the wood supply store, find yourself some nice straight grained hickory, woodwork it into the shape of a handle and whatnot. Generally, it's easier to go to the store and buy a pre-made handle. Unfortunately, that is not always an option. Like if you have a hammer that is so big, this is upside down, that ain't gonna work out so hot. But I wanted to show you guys what to look for in a handle at the store, and more importantly, what to avoid, because generally the people who are making these handles are not so concerned with the life of your tool. So what we have here is a piece of hickory, and at first glance, we've got our grain running in this direction. Now that's not too bad. The kind of general rule of thumb is that you want the grain to be running parallel with the eye of the hammer, that you want the grain of the wood to be running in line with the hammer. However, a couple years ago, my buddy Ethan Hardy made a video where he kind of disproved the whole, it has to be running with the grain. If it's running sideways, that's all right as well, as long as there's not very much grain run out. This handle, for example, has very bad grain run out. The direction of the wood is like this along it. And that means that when you start right here, it ends about right there. So that is about how much strength the handle has, whereas a good handle would have grain that ran straight from the eye all the way to the butt. That means that you have as much strength pretty much in the handle as you're going to be able to get. If you really want to avoid grain run out in your handle, this is going to be about as weak of a handle as you can buy. Now this handle is a lot better. It's still not quite perfect, but you see that grain runs parallel with the handle for a good portion of this handle. Now it's still not quite exactly straight back and forth, could be better. I feel pretty confident that this handle, this hickory, would hold up fairly well. Now I would probably still end up chopping it about right there or so, and I would actually probably end up using this side right here where the grain is really straight, because pretty much the area where we see handles break right in this area here. And so this is where we want our really good grain to be. If the handle has a little bit of grain run out down here, it's not going to matter unless you're holding it perfectly firmly right there and getting some good power out of it. You're never going to break it there anyway. Since neither of these hammer handles fit, the third and most creative way to build a hammer handle is from a block of wood. Now this is a piece of hickory that I got from the store. This is unfortunately not super square grain from this side, but thankfully we have tools. And so I'm going to go ahead and first things first, take this to my belt sander and rip this block and square it up with the grain of the board. Right now it runs at almost a 45-degree angle. It would be all right because we have good straight grain. You see there's no run out. The grain runs pretty parallel from front to back. Since I'm building this hammer handle to last, I want this to have as straight of grain as possible. And so I'm going to take this to my belt sander and first thing, get it squared up with the grain. So now that I've got my general blank roughed out, my grain is running straight with the handle in line. The flat face of the hammer might be here, the peen of the hammer right there. I've got very little grain run out. This is actually a really nice piece of hickory. It's got very tight grain to it. Next step is to throw an 8-inch contact wheel onto the grinder. That's actually a fairly important thing. That is a really nice radius to allow this hammerhead to kind of snug up. That's that first shoulder that we're going to build in our handle. I've marked where the 20-inch mark is, and so this is going to be how long our hammer handle is. I might end up chopping it down to 18 or 19 inches depending on how I like, but we're going to get this thing fit up before we do any of that. A quick note before we jump into the grinding room is a note about the hammerhead itself, something that you might have to modify, as a lot of the production hammers didn't come with them straight out of the gate, and that is a chamfer around the bottom of the eye. You can see that that's a really sharp transition from the flat face of it to the inside of the eye. You can either do it with a hand file if your hammer is soft enough, or a carbide burr on a die grinder or on a Dremel or something like that. We want to round this out and give that a nice smooth shoulder. For one thing, it'll make the fitting process a little bit easier to have a leading shoulder in, and then it'll also make it so that it's not cutting into the wood itself. If that shoulder is too sharp, it'll shave away the wood rather than compress it. We want the wood to compress as we're hammering on that handle rather than having it take off chunks or scrape away pieces of wood. And it'll make that whole fitting process a little bit easier. So I'm going to take my little micromotor with a carbide burr and kind of shave around and smooth out that eye real quick. So now onto the 8-inch contact wheel to rough down the general shape. We're basically going to have the shape of this eye run from the top all the way to where it starts to swell out right there. Before we do the final seating of the head, we want to clean that head up a little bit. First by taking it to the wire wheel, cleaning off the dirt and rust, and then cleaning up the faces using a 120 grit belt on a slight slack belt. That'll kind of break my corners. I want to get the chipping and the pitting out of the edges of the flat face and then give it a slightly rounded contour to it so it's not completely dead flat. I do this by taking it to that slack belt and kind of pressing in gently from both directions so it's rounded in both directions, not just one. And then kind of blending that into my edges. Same thing on the cross peen side of things. I want to break the very hard corners. I don't want those hard corners to leave dents in my workpiece or to be potential places on the hammer that could chip off. And so I want to round those out. And then I finish that off by blending everything up with a nice brown Scotch-Brite belt super aggressive. It really rounds everything out and blends it. And then a little bit of wax, and it's ready to get thrown on the head. There's our finished head. It looks nice. It's that kind of restored wire brushed look to it. Our faces are a nice satin finish. That'll be a nice face to both strike top tools with or to strike iron if we need to. And same thing with this peen. It's a great looking peen right there. Now we can move on to shaping our handle. The thing to note is that as you're shaping right here with your contact wheel, you want to make sure that you have it nice and even all the way around. You see that's a nice, it's not perfect, but it's mostly even contouring there. And that'll just set you up for it to look good as we start to do our next part. So we're going to have our divot in there. And then it'll just be kind of straight from there on out. And then I'll just chamfer the bottom of it. I'm going to do a slight octagonalizing to it, so there will be some facets on there that'll help index a little bit. I like the aesthetics of it as well. And we're going to do most of this on the 8-inch contact wheel, especially our contouring and like heavy ripping down. And then we will finish it off on the flat platen to get all those facets tuned up and looking. So let's away into the grinding room, shall we? All right, so here are our three pieces that are making up our hammer. We've got our handle. This is a nice American straight grained hickory. We've got a walnut wedge. The wedge doesn't have to be walnut. That's just a nice little color splash you can add. It should be any sort of wood that has a little bit of compression to it, but is still fairly strong. So hickory is another great choice. And the reason why we want the wedge is because, like we showed earlier in our drawing, the inside of a hammer eye looks like this. And so the bottom of the hammer eye fits around that swell out there. And then you can see we've got plenty of room around the top there. And this wedge will drive out the top now that we've cut our slit. You want to cut the slit most of the way down. I'd say about 2/3 of the way through the eye. You don't want to cut it all the way. You don't want to see the bottom of the slit at the bottom of your handle. That would be icky. It just needs to be wide enough that that wedge will have room to widen out the top of your eye. So we're going to take our wedge. Some people use glue, some people don't. I personally don't use glue. We live in such a dry climate here that I don't necessarily find that it's necessary. You start to drive in your eye. We'll use this little hammer here. You go tippy tap. And you can see that as I do that, the top of that handle really starts to swell out. Oh yeah. Look at that. Our wedge broke in half. That is just fine. We're actually going to throw a steel wedge in here also. You can forge them out. You can buy them at the store. Let's just grab a little piece of stock. That'll do. Just a junky little taper that I forged out at some point. I'm going to cut it about right here. Cut about 3/4 of an inch. And then we'll do stock removal on the rest of it. All right, so the wedge just has a slight taper in both directions. It goes from about 1/4 inch thick to about 3/32. I could have gone a little bit thinner with it, but it was burning my fingers, so I'm just going to drive it in there. All right, and now we're going back into the grinding room to flush up the top of that. Now we're going to use a little bit of pine tar, this juicy stuff, to coat our handle in. It's what Jake Ferrum uses. It's what Alex Steele uses. Normally it goes on burnt handles, but it'll darken up this hickory just a bit and make it nice and grippy. Now I left this handle at a 60 grit, and so it'll still have a little bit of grippiness to it, which will be nice when you're forging. You don't want it super slippery to fall out of your hands. That would be bad. If you do go to buy pine tar, make sure you get the liquid stuff. I've never messed around with the solid stuff, but I know that it's a form that you can buy it in, but I don't think that it will work all that well. God, that, Isaiah, give that a smell. What a great looking hammer. Very interesting. I don't know why they would have done the step down before having that peen come out. That's just like the hardest possible way that they could have made this hammer, especially in forging. It looks great though. I think it's a very cool looking hammer. This adds a new level of utility to my shop that I didn't have before. Having the lighter, short-handled striking hammer. One hand to go right there, one hand to go right there. And then be able to bonk things. What a treat to be able to have a piece of Italian history come back to work here in Montana in my shop. Well, I am thrilled to have wrapped up this hammer. Hopefully you guys understand the process of how to take a raw piece of hickory to a finished hammer handle, as well as how to choose the length and kind of the design for the piece as well as the whole hammer hanging process. That's what it's called, by the way, hanging a hammer. Who knew? Weird name. Don't understand it, but that's what it's called. Thank you to Harry's for sponsoring today's episode. Thank you to the patrons for patronizing me. And now, a fun little video YouTube, trick is that at the very end of the video, what we like to do is end it. Goodbye.